When does political accountability become a personal vendetta? When does parliamentary censure become partisan score settling? And when does excuse-making become denial or defiance become arrogance? These are the sorts of questions we're all left with after the ugly spectacle in Parliament today, where 3 hours of debate was devoted to censuring former Prime Minister Scott Morrison over his so-called secret ministry affair. This is an episode that's already been exposed. There have been 2 detailed inquiries and they've been made public, their reports. So we all know already what we need to know about this affair. We've heard from all the key players, including attempted explanations and limited apologies from Morrison himself. And already remedies have been put in place to ensure it won't happen again. So what was the point of today? And was all this necessary?
I have no intention now, Mr Speaker, of submitting to the political intimidation of this government using its numbers in this place to impose its retribution on a political opponent.
I thought this morning we would see some contrition. Some. A semblance of contrition. We got none of that. We got hubris, and we got arrogance, and we got denial.
Yeah, it was a pretty tough debate about why on earth Morrison had himself sworn in to oversee 5 other departmental areas, yet didn't tell the Parliament, didn't tell Cabinet, didn't tell the public, or even most of the ministers involved. His actions were unnecessary, they were secretive and bizarre, but Morrison today tried to justify them because of the pressures at the time.
The government's response to censure and prosecute this motion is to engage in the politics of retribution and nothing less. Sure. These are the behaviours of an opposition, Mr Speaker, not a government, who understands that grace in victory is a virtue.
Now, his justification, saying that this was all the pressures of the pandemic and preparing for all sorts of possible eventualities, doesn't really cut it. Because, in fact, the singular focus of the government at that time and the amount of interaction between the ministers and the constant media conferences about the pandemic response and various issues only make it more remarkable that Morrison never made any of this public, outlining it perhaps as part of his pandemic precautions. But perhaps the most extraordinary explanation from Morrison today was this.
Had I been asked about these matters at the time at the numerous press conferences I held, I would have responded truthfully about the arrangements I had put in place.
Order.
Say what? If someone had only asked the then Prime Minister whether he had secretly had himself sworn in to hold power over other ministers' departments, he would then have given a full and frank answer. What an absurdity. And worse, it doesn't stack up against the one time he did use those extra powers. Morrison had himself sworn into the resources portfolio because he was worried his minister Keith Pitt would approve a gas exploration project that Morrison wanted to reject. Yet even when he was asked about this decision and the minister's attitude at the time, late last year, Morrison pointedly did not reveal the arrangements. Listen carefully.
Yeah, it's the decision of the government, and I decided to take the decision as the Prime Minister, which I'm authorised to do. And I did this because I wanted to ensure that we took a whole-of-government understanding of this decision.
Because he's authorised to do? Morrison could have and should have said he was authorised to make the decision because he had had himself sworn in with extra powers. But he patently did not say anything of the kind. So, really? He now says he'd have revealed it all if only he was asked? Well, it looks a little hollow, doesn't it?
Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that the non-disclosure of arrangements has caused unintentional offence and extend an apology to those who were offended. But, Mr Speaker, I do not apologise for taking action, especially prudent redundancy action, in a national crisis in order to save lives and to save livelihoods.
Now, this is where Morrison has been stubborn, refusing to apologise beyond the tiny cohort of the ministers he deceived. What about apologising to all of his other cabinet colleagues, to all of his party room, to all of the parliament, and most importantly, to all of the public? The deception here, the lack of transparency here, was not just with a select group of colleagues, but to the democratic process and the whole country.
The former Prime Minister owes an apology not to people who he shared brekkie with at the Lodge. He owes an apology to the Australian people for the undermining of democracy, and that's why this motion should be supported by every member of this House.
Yeah, the censure was carried, of course, with one Liberal crossing the floor to vote with the Labor government, others certainly wishing they might be able to do the same. But the coalition MPs were put in an invidious position here. Vote in favour of transparency and join Labor and the other MPs on one side of Parliament denouncing Morrison? That would have been a terrible demonisation of a former Prime Minister, and one that Peter Dutton just couldn't countenance. Instead, they voted to support Morrison's justification, which was only partly reasonable. All this could have and should have been avoided if only Morrison had made a more adequate apology and explanation weeks ago. It was a sad affair today. It was made all the more wasteful because all of this personal and partisan focus and partisan focus on Morrison misses the bigger point. This was but one example of one man, one politician, one Prime Minister who overreached as part of the pandemic response. He grabbed power unnecessarily and without proper accountability. Versions of this power grab and panicked pandemic overreach happened in every parliament, in every state in this country. It happened with our police too, and our health bureaucracies, and even in private sector HR departments. It happened in the opposition parties too, where they were only too willing to see freedoms trashed, liberties curtailed, educations vandalised and budgets ruined. Perhaps by humiliating Morrison over his pandemic overreach, the rest of these politicians hope nobody will look too hard at their own complicity. It really underscores why we need a proper national royal commission into how we were governed during the pandemic.